Здравствуйте, это программа «Первая студия», Первый национальный канал. И у меня в гостях Abigail Jones. Hello.
Hi.
Very nice to meet you, and thank you very much that you agreed to come for this program. I think it will be easier if you will present yourself and tell us what are you doing in Ukraine.
Sure. So thank you too. My name is Abigail Jones and I am the Mine Risk Education Project Manager for the Danish Refugee Council Specialist Unit, the Danish Demining Group. And we are in the process of implementing a mine risk education project in the government-controlled areas of Oblast Luhansk and Oblast Donetsk.
I have to admit that the reason why I invited you to the program, because I was very much emotionally touched in the discussion with you, because when it's about my country and that it's a mine education in my country, which sounds very much like strange, as if we are in a movie or something like that. So how important it is for Ukraine for the moment, the mine education for kids?
I would say that in the context of everything that has happened in the last few years, it is incredibly important, particularly in Oblast Luhansk and Oblast Donetsk, in the government-controlled areas and also in those areas under the control of the de facto authorities. This is in terms of the people who have stayed in the highly affected zones where there has been a lot of fighting. It's also in terms of the internally displaced people who will start to return to these areas, because where explosive remnants of war and anti-personnel landmines have been used, there is an increased likelihood of them having accidents. And it's incredibly important to raise awareness and increase knowledge amongst the affected population to make sure that they have the information to protect themselves from these risks.
And you look like very gentle, very delicate lady. How long do you work in such a field?
Okay, I've worked in mine action for nearly 6 years now. I started in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was working in a province called Equateur. We were carrying out an activity called a general mine action assessment. And this is essentially trying to identify the areas where battles have taken place and to understand more about the types of contamination that exist there. We were also involved in carrying out mine risk education for the affected communities. And one of the things that I was involved in was the development and the piloting of mine risk education as part of the national curriculum for children in the affected areas.
You mean curriculum, the one which is taught at schools, so children would be taught about mines at schools?
Exactly, exactly. And this was just the pilot phase. It was also funded by UNICEF. And the idea was that in a country as large as the Democratic Republic of Congo, it wasn't necessary to teach MRE in all schools throughout the country. So specific areas were chosen, and we worked a lot with the different authorities there to get their acceptance and to train the teachers to carry out mine risk education as part of the national curriculum.
Are you putting a stake at the Ministry of Education for the moment? Are you going to teach kids in Ukraine also through the schools or in some other ways?
It's a great question. So the project which we are working on with UNICEF, it does involve training teachers as mine risk education facilitators in the school system. So the Ministry of Education is aware of this project, and we will be working with them through UNICEF to basically get the necessary authorization to train the teachers in Oblast Luhansk and Oblast Donetsk.
But how important it is? For example, let's say if the conflict is over tomorrow, for how much time is this still important for the kids or for civilians or for anybody who lives in or used to live in the conflict zone and is planning to come back?
Sure. Another great question. So if I take the example of my work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the area that we were working in had not been experiencing conflict for 10 to 15 years, but there was still a lot of contamination, in particular cluster munitions in this area, which had been used during the conflict but was still spread out very widely in a number of the communities where we were working. So that, for me, illustrates the point that even after a conflict has finished, it is still very important when you have this residual contamination to make sure that children and also adults in the community have the information so that they can adopt the appropriate safety behaviours.
how can you say if the campaign, let's say, on this is efficient or not? How can you, because we can say, oh, we are making a campaign, but is it efficient? Will it really save lives? How can you know?
So the organisation that I work for, the Danish Refugee Council and the specialist unit, the Danish Demining Group, has done a lot of work to try and look at how we can actually assess whether or not we are making a difference. Because I think it's fair to say that in Mine Action, there has been a tendency towards reporting outputs of activities. So reporting on the number of children that have participated in a mine risk education session, reporting on the number of teachers that were trained. But what we are trying to do is establish systems which look at whether or not the participants in the MRE sessions actually have increased knowledge of the threats that exist, whether they actually have increased knowledge of the behaviours that they should adopt, and whether they have increased knowledge of the reporting mechanisms which they can utilise to inform, in the context of Ukraine, the State Emergency Service of any contamination which they come across. The other thing which we are looking at is evaluating behaviour change. And so, as you know, as part of this project, we are going to be carrying out in the next few months a knowledge, attitudes and practices survey. And this is going to establish a baseline. So we will understand more about the existing knowledge, the existing attitudes and the existing practices of the target communities related to landmines and other explosive remnants of war. And towards the end of the project, we'll be able to carry out a similar exercise and we'll be able to compare the results of that.
And do you have any data now on the kids who were affected, or adults who were affected, or any kind of anecdotal data even?
When you're talking about data, are you referring to casualty data or?
Casualty data with mines and explosives, yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that we're also looking at as part of this project is to establish pathways and a casualty surveillance system so that we can access casualty data related to mines and explosive remnants of war injuries. This is something which we're working on again with UNICEF and the Ministry of Health to try and access the information which we need to understand more about who is most affected. And one of the things that we are particularly looking at as part of this are different types of injury patterns, because that can tell us a lot.
What do you mean by injury patterns? Because it sounds too technical, too medical. So what do you mean by injury patterns?
Okay. So the ICRC had basically identified 3 different injury patterns which they say are very, very useful when it comes to talking about landmine and explosive remnant of war injuries. So the first one is when somebody will have lost one or both of their legs, and this is a pattern which typically comes as a result of stepping on a landmine. So if you know that somebody has lost one or both legs, you can understand that that is what's happened. The second injury pattern basically involves fragmentation and wounds across the body, and this can come from being in the proximity of a landmine or being in the proximity of the explosion of another explosive remnant of war. The final pattern which we look at is when somebody has lost one or both of their hands, and this helps us to understand that perhaps the person was in the process of handling the device and it exploded. So if we're able to access that kind of information, it will help us to understand more about who is at risk, the kinds of activities which they're carrying out which put them at risk, and that will then enable us to design really targeted mine risk education initiatives to target the most in need.
And out of your experience, what was the most successful campaign in the world, let's say, done on this?
The most successful in the world?
Yeah, if you are out of the countries where you worked, what was the most successful and what really worked? What really stopped children from, doing risky stuff?
That's a difficult question. The most successful in the world. I mean, I think every country has its own unique challenges to being able to carry out mine risk education. And one thing that I should also mention is that there are many different components of the MRE process. So we have educational and training initiatives, there's public information dissemination, we have mine risk education in emergencies.
But what really works when you teach parents how to speak to their kids or something else?
Again, I think it depends very much on the context. So an approach which works in Ukraine may not be appropriate for Somalia.
What do you think will work in Ukraine?
In Ukraine? I think what we need to do before we can say what will work the best is to carry out the knowledge, attitudes and practices survey to understand more about the different risk-taking behaviours, because we can categorise that into people who are unaware, people who are uninformed, people who are forced to take risks, people who have received the wrong information, so the misinformed, and then also the reckless. And if we can understand within the context of Ukraine which people carrying out which activities fall into those different categories, then we'll be able to design our MRE in a way which meets their specific needs. So to be able to say that an approach which has been used in Afghanistan, for example, where they have a big problem with boys and adolescents collecting scrap metal, the approach which is used there may not work in the context of Ukraine, but it's important to understand more through the CAP survey.
So it will be tailored for needs of Ukraine depending on the behaviors of Ukrainian kids, right?
Exactly, and I think that's one of the most important things about any mine risk education initiative. It needs to be tailored. That's in terms of the messages which are given, it's in terms of the methodology that is used, and it's in terms of who is actually carrying out the MRE, who is the most important and influential person for the target group. So for example, in Somalia, what they are increasingly trying to do, particularly to influence the behavior of boys and young men, is to work with the mullah, because they are somebody within the community who can really influence the behavior of this particular category of risk takers. And what they're also doing in Somalia is they are training health workers, because then they can speak with the women, whereas the mullah cannot because of the cultural constraints. And the idea there is that if they provide mine risk education to women, because of their position in the family where they are the one who is responsible for educating the children, they will be able to pass the messages.
I suspect something like that might work in Ukraine as well. I mean, that women have very big position in influencing the family and education of the kids.
Sure.
And do people talk enough about it in Ukraine? I mean, is it enough public discussion of what you feel? Let's say you see some local people out of different institutions, ministries, organizations, just your friends, you go to a restaurant, let's say, and bar or something and talk to your friends. Mm-hmm. How do people react when you say what you are doing in Ukraine?
When I speak with people outside of Ukraine?
When you speak with people in Ukraine, how do they react to what you are doing? Do they perceive it as something important, or do they perceive it as something very far from the needs of Ukraine? And how do they react?
I would say that the reaction is mixed, because a lot of the people who I know here, they also have knowledge of mine action and of the importance of mine risk education. So with those people, yes, they definitely do see a very pressing need. I think it's something which is increasingly coming onto the agenda of many people at many different levels, particularly talking about the humanitarian sector.
Like volunteers?
Volunteers are definitely raising a lot of reports about casualties and accidents which are happening. And one of the things which we are looking into, and I think is actually very, very important, is providing mine awareness safety training to civilian volunteer networks and also to humanitarian organizations which are carrying out activities in the highly affected areas. Because when you have people who are going in to carry out evacuations, or to start reconstruction efforts, or where you have IDPs which want to return to their former communities, it's really important that those people have the knowledge of what they may find there and how they would then be able to protect themselves. We received a report just the other day of, I think it was in the non-government controlled part of Donetsk, where up to eight workers had been killed when they'd gone in to basically rehabilitate a water pipeline.
Oh.
I'm not sure exactly what the type of munition was, but it's these kinds of cases which, as people start to return, as reconstruction efforts start to intensify, it's going to be a real problem.
Do we have enough specialists in Ukraine to conduct this type of activities like trainings, or you think that there should be more international aid on bringing in experts from outside?
I would say that there is definitely a need for increased activities. So I'll speak just for our project. As I said to you, at this stage it is just in the government-controlled areas of Oblast Luhansk and Oblast Donetsk. We have plans to expand into the area under the control of the de facto authorities in Donetsk, but that is entirely dependent on funding. And this is definitely one of the big issues. But if you look at the maps of where the majority of the fighting has taken place, on these confrontations along the ceasefire line, there's going to be a huge need for mine risk education. And I would say that for us, in our current capacity, we will not be able to meet those needs, but we are actively seeking funding and intending to expand our operations to be able to do that. There are also other stakeholders that are intending to carry out mine risk education activities. There's the ICRC, ADRA is also planning to implement mine risk education, and the YMCA. So I think there are a number of different actors out there.
And your main Ukrainian partners are Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health. Who else is working with you on this?
With DRC, yeah, so it's the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, the State Emergency Services. We are planning to work with a couple of civilian volunteer networks to carry out the Knowledge, Attitudes and Practices survey as well.
And what is the most frequently asked question to you or to your colleagues while working in Ukraine on this project? What do people ask?
Ooh, that's a difficult question.
What are people curious about?
It's actually quite interesting for me because, I'll be honest with you, the majority of my experiences related to mine action have been in very, very different contexts. And I think the difference in Ukraine is that the state institutions which have been dealing with the residual contamination that already existed here are already very well established and do have some good capacities for mine action activities. So people are actually quite aware of some of the challenges that exist. So in terms of the most common question, I mean, I'd say it probably comes from some of the humanitarian actors asking more about the different areas which are most highly affected and how that will impact on their activities.
One of the reasons I'm asking, because I'm closely, surveying what's going on Facebook on this topic, and it's not a discussed topic on Facebook, which is really strange because it's a huge threat to anybody who would go to this zone, but still it's not properly discussed. And I find it a bit strange. So why do you think it's not discussed?
Well, one of the things which we are also aiming to do as part of the project is to use social media as a way of raising awareness about these issues. So we have a specialist team which are working on that, and they carried out a survey previously to look at the different kinds of social media that exist here, which are the most commonly used and by who. And the idea is that over the rest of the project, they will identify the most appropriate platforms for having these discussions for the target groups which we're seeking to reach out to. So to try and raise awareness through those particular channels. So it's something which is...
And in which other countries have you worked apart from Congo and Ukraine?
Which other countries? So in terms of where I've worked long term, it's been the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's been Kenya, and it's been Sierra Leone. But prior to coming here, I was working for an organization in Geneva called the Gender in Mine Action Program. So I was based in Switzerland, but I was carrying out capacity development activities in many different countries around the world. So with that organization, I visited Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Somaliland, Croatia, South Sudan, Darfur. I mean, so Senegal, many different countries, many different contexts.
So out of your experience and probably out of your personal views on things, we see now lots of pictures, photos, and even on the news I saw, like today on Euronews, there was like a short piece of the video news where kids are playing with the weapons, and where kids ask soldiers, let's say, to play with the weapons, and everything, like all the playground is about war and sides and conflict sides, and you know how kids do this. How do you think it will affect the generation, or probably several generations, or it won't?
I think it depends very much on how long the conflict goes on for, in terms of the extent to which it affects the children of a particular generation. I mean, I think in terms of psychological trauma, it will definitely have an impact. And I think in that kind of context, it's very important to have clear structures and clear projects and programs which deal with that kind of issue. I mean, if I look at some other country contexts where the conflict has gone on for decades, where you have generations of young people who have only known conflict, that has a very significant impact on the country and on the future stability of that country.
Future stability, you mean that kids playing into these things are getting very emotionally involved into the idea of the conflict itself, or something else?
I think where you have a country where you have a generation that they have only known conflict, it means that there can be much more of a tendency to return to use conflict as a means of resolving difficulties.
Okay.
But perhaps I'm misunderstanding your question slightly. You mean in terms of them being used to the different kinds of munitions that exist? Or
not only the munitions, we just keep discussing it, you know, between ourselves, especially at work, since we want this project to be successful, and we discuss the effect on kids. Right. And I am thinking that our parents grew up after the World War II, you know, and they, I guess, were as well playing the same games, you know, like, I don't know, Soviets against Germans, or red ones against white ones, and all this. So does it really affect generations somehow psychologically, emotionally, or not?
I'm not a child development expert, so I don't think I can properly answer that question. I also, when I was a child, I played these games with my brother and his friends. So how much we can say that that is something which happens anyway with children, or how much it is something which comes as a result of having grown up in a period of conflict, is difficult for me to say. But one thing that I've noticed in Ukraine from speaking with a number of different people, because you have had this residual contamination problem from the Second World War, from the Soviet era, I've heard a lot of stories from older people of how when they were growing up, there were these different munitions around, and I've heard a number of stories of people taking different items and trying to burn them, or trying to open them up for chemistry experiments, this kind of thing. So I think actually one of the challenges for mine risk education is in such a context where you have people who are very used to these issues. So then again, you have to tailor your messages, because you've got people who have lived with the problem for a long time and have developed coping mechanisms to deal with it. So I think in that kind of situation, you have to, again, re-strategize and think about how you can tailor your MRE messages for those people.
And let's say the mine risk education will start, I mean, the education campaign will start and be a wide campaign. Do you expect that there will be resistance from the level of parents or from grandmothers and grandfathers? Because the subject is cruel, you know, do you think that there will be resistance and people would like not to talk about it to their kids?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think with any project activity, particularly those that involve children, one of the most important first steps is to take the time to sit with the parents and the adults in their life to understand more about how they view the issue. So that is something which we are going to be doing as part of the Knowledge, Attitudes and Practices survey, because that will then allow us to think about how we can then continue to engage with those adults to make them understand the importance of these issues. But from my perspective, from my experience in other countries, parents are often very keen to take on board these messages.
So you expect that they will support the whole idea of such an education campaign?
Like I said, every context is different, but that is why we need to carry out this survey, to understand more about how we can most effectively engage with these influential people in the children's lives.
And you said that even if the conflict will stop tomorrow, let's say, so for years and years, and probably for 10 years, there will be still some contamination, right, with different explosives and mines there might be. Did I understand you correct?
That was definitely the case in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, it varies from country to country. It depends on the capacity of state institutions to coordinate and deal with any residual risk. It also, yeah, I mean, that's one of the big
Financially
challenges.
speaking, is it expensive for the country to deal with all this issue on the
in terms
contamination?
Of
in terms of clearance of this contamination, yes. How expensive it is for the budget, and should there be a separate budget line in the country of the conflict to deal with it, or it's usually done by international community?
I mean, in a lot of countries where you have these issues, there are many more international actors which are involved in the clearance and in the explosive ordnance disposal components of the work. This is often because in those countries, the national institutions, because of the long-running conflicts, they don't have the capacity or the funding to be able to carry out those activities themselves. I think Ukraine is a very different context. You already have a number of national institutions which have been dealing with explosive ordnance disposal for a number of years, so there is existing capacity there. One of the challenges here is that there has not been any survey to understand more about the extent of the contamination. So that would be an important step to understand, like I said, the extent of the contamination, and then to have a clearer idea on how long it would take to be able to remove all of those
And how much
threats.
money it might cost?
It depends on the context. There was an interesting study done about a year ago which actually compared the costs of clearance and explosive ordnance disposal in a number of different countries and between different organizations, and there were huge variations.
Like millions of dollars less?
I mean, clearance activities are very expensive.
Expensive.
I don't have the exact figure in my head, but they are very, very expensive. But that is why it's very important to invest heavily in what we call the non-technical survey to understand more about the extent of the problem. Because if you are able to well identify those areas, then you are going to be less likely to be spending loads and loads of money on clearing areas where you actually find that there is no contamination.
And what do you think is the best way for the government to speak about the casualties or not to speak about the casualties? Is it good to make this statistic very public, or it will scare people too much? What's the best way?
I mean, I think it's very, very important to have that information available when there is going to be a clear use for it. So from our perspective, it is very, very useful because it will allow us to better design our mine risk education program. And it would be the same for other MRE actors within the context of Ukraine. Having that kind of casualty data available is also very important when it comes to discussions on victim assistance service provision. Because if you have that data available and you have it disaggregated, for example, according to age, to gender, to type of accident, and if you also include things such as data on what we call indirect victims, and that is the family of the
Which
survivor.
loses somebody like dear to them.
Well, either somebody who is killed or somebody who is injured. Having that kind of data available is very, very useful in being able to design
For you
assistance.
as an expert, yes, but should it be in the access of general public? Should people see it on the news? Let's say you switch on the news and they tell you this is and this and that case of casualties and children come into this and that situation.
I mean, I think it's important to have transparency in terms of the data that is available. I think it's also important to report on these issues in a responsible way. So by which I mean not in a way that's going to aggravate any situations. When I was much younger, I went to Pakistan to attend a conference on the role of media and international institutions in conflict and post-conflict situations. And one of the things which came out of that is that the media has a very, very clear role in terms of how it reports on certain issues, because this can, in the context of Pakistan, it can really aggravate the conflict. It can lead to further incidents taking place.
Are you planning to work with media in Ukraine?
We are, yes. So part of the project which we are working on involves public information dissemination. And so this, the exact format has yet to be identified, and that again will come as a result of the knowledge attitudes practices. Are you
planning only to work with IDPs and those people who live in non-controlled or controlled government area by the government, or you think that those activities will somehow involve the other territory of Ukraine?
For this current project, we are just focusing on the government-controlled areas of Oblast Luhansk and Oblast Donetsk. But I think it is important that it is the mine risk education initiatives are spread beyond that, because actually if you look at the distribution of IDPs in Ukraine at the moment, they're not just in Oblast Luhansk, they're not just in Oblast Donetsk.
Country. Yeah.
Exactly.
What would you expect from the government? What would you, in an ideal situation, what would you expect from the government? What kind of cooperation you want to have from the government?
Okay, I'd say that the government has already been very cooperative, particularly as a result of their existing good relationship with UNICEF. So the Ministry of Education, for example, is very, very supportive of the project. In terms of additional support which we would require for the project, it's really in terms of enabling us to access some of these communities, perhaps by providing a letter of support to the project. That is something which will be hugely useful.
So the access is the main thing where it would be good to have support.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And are you planning to involve lots of experts from lots of different countries for this project? Or you think that you repeated many times that Ukraine has some expertise due to the experience of the Second World War. Is it enough expertise, or do you want to bring more experts from other countries? Did weapons change since the Second World War, or the patterns are still the same?
Sure, that's a great question actually. So one of our experts came at the end of last year to do an assessment and to look at the situation, because you're absolutely right, the type of munitions that have been used are very, very different compared to the residual contamination that existed before. I am not a technical person when it comes to these kinds of munitions, but I think it is fair to say that there may be a need for additional training and perhaps additional equipment in order to be able to deal with these new kinds of munitions.
And if I ask you to have several sets of advice, and let's say your first advices are going to the parents, what would you tell to the parents, taking into account that lots of parents and IDPs will be looking at this program? What would be your set of advice to them?
My set of advice to parents, I mean, firstly, that this is an issue which they need to take seriously, because children, particularly young boys at a global level, often do have accidents due to natural curiosity, various different factors. My advice would be to tell your children, if they find any suspicious item, don't touch it. If you suspect an area of being mined or that there are booby traps there, don't enter it. And if you do come across any suspicious items or suspicious areas, tell a responsible adult. So tell your parent, tell your teacher, and that they can then inform the state emergency service.
What would be your advice to medical community?
To the medical community? My advice to the medical community would be, again, making people aware of these issues. I think the medical community are very, very well placed because they have a lot of interaction with the general population. So within the medical community, whilst they are not themselves going to be trained mine risk education facilitators, they could be well placed to hand out brochures or to have posters displayed within the clinics, within the hospitals, where it also raises awareness of the issues.
And finally, what will be your advice to the Cabinet of Ministries and the President in such a situation? Because it's a highly unusual situation in the country like Ukraine.
Right. I mean, my advice to the Cabinet Ministry and the President would be that this is a very serious issue, that contamination from these explosive remnants of war will be a serious impediment to the return of the internally displaced population. So it is something which requires their attention. And there are a lot of organizations which are willing to assist in terms of the mine risk education which they can provide, in terms of other support to some of the state institutions. So this is something which definitely needs to be addressed.
And when do you expect this awareness campaign for kids will start?
So the Knowledge, Attitudes and Practices survey will begin by the end of the month, and that should take 3 weeks. Then we will have a few days to analyse the results, and we will also discuss those results with the Mine Risk Education Coordination Group. The Knowledge, Attitudes, Practices Survey Coordination Group, which has been established. And so that will be an opportunity for all of the different stakeholders which are planning to carry out MRE to basically look at the results and decide how they're going to use that to inform the design of the messages.
And when do you think it will finally start?
Oh, let's say May.
You think it will start in May, and it will last for a long time, as far as I understand?
I mean, for our project, we will start with the training of teachers in the schools and the training of peer educators. Our project will run until September, but like I told you before, we're actively seeking funding to continue the program.
Because it's a long work, as far as I imagine.
Unfortunately,
very long work.
yes. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for coming to this TV show and for raising such a cruel subject, but very important subject in order to save kids in Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you too for the time.
Это была первая студия на Первом национальном.